Perfect. Okay, to start us off, we're gonna do a little check-in question. As Anna mentioned in the big group, our team has worked really hard on this webinar, so please feel free to send your celebrations or anything that you think is really cool in the chat. So our check-in question is, how are you already looking at STEM from a race perspective? What about race from a STEM perspective? Again, share if you are comfortable in the chat.
Yes, thank you so much. Epigenetics is super interesting. I know as a scientist myself, I think a lot about science history and the racist impacts of artificial intelligence. Yes, white supremacy dictates knowledge value. Exactly.
We're going to get into that in this webinar.
Yes.
And in this breakout room specifically.
Yes, environmental science. Gattaca. Thank you guys so much for sharing.
Thank you.
Sorry, I'm having a little bit of trouble with these slides here, and I don't really know why. There we go.
Okay, so just as an overview of what we're going to cover in this breakout room, we'll start with the scientists and the science. Then we'll go into involving, engaging, and empowering your students in the classroom. And then we'll do a little activity we like to call Who Did It First? And then finally, we'll end with practical examples for your curriculum.
So hi again. I am a sophomore at Yale University, like I said, and I'm also a pre-med and molecular, cellular, and developmental biology major. And while I was researching for this webinar, I came across this amazing book called Knowing Home, Braiding Indigenous Science with Western Science. I highly, highly recommend reading the whole book, but one of my favorite quotes is here on the slide. Every culture and every society has its own science, and its function is sustaining its mother society and culture. And this quote really speaks to me. Growing up, I never learned about anyone who looked like me, even though my classes had a lot of Asian Americans. We were all just trying to conform to the white American status quo. So when Carlene and I were thinking about race and STEM and looking for stories of people of color, I realized that I couldn't think of anything. I couldn't think of a single story, scientific discovery made, or scientist I'd learned about in school made by people who looked like me. I know that Asians have a rich and advanced and robust history of science, but I never learned about it. I never saw non-white people in STEM. My history and my people were erased from the narrative. As someone who plans on dedicating her life to STEM and STEM education, I'm realizing that it's surprising that I love STEM as deeply as I do. I think it's because of my privilege and my parents' insistence that I go to fun STEM summer camps. And it's because my freshman biology teacher, who was a woman of color, encouraged me and cultivated me and validated me in science. But most people don't have that privilege. So what can we do to involve and engage and empower students of color? How can we have difficult conversations about race in our STEM classrooms?
So the first step in having difficult conversations in the classroom is acknowledging that many STEM schools of learning are rooted in white supremacy. We coined this concept as separating the science from the scientist. That is, taking a nuanced stance in understanding the value and importance of the theories that shape STEM curriculum today, while also acknowledging that the people that pervade its history are often symbols and perpetrators of white supremacy. In short, we strive to understand the context of the science in the context of the scientists, I mean. When we don't center BIPOC students in the classroom, especially in STEM classrooms, we remain complicit in perpetuating the white narrative and make it seem as though BIPOC people have no space in these spheres. It confirms students' internalized racism, i.e., I don't see myself in the subject, thus I do not belong in this subject. So we're going to go into our activity called Who Did It First? And we're going to start off with the Pythagorean theorem. Although the theorem was first introduced in Plimpton 322, a Babylonian tablet dating back to 1900 BCE, The theorem is credited and literally named after Greek philosopher Pythagoras. Here we see how white supremacy is literally built into the language that we use in the classroom. In centering white history at the expense of BIPOC people, we tell our students that their history and their culture is less important or lesser than. Another example of who did it first comes in the field of genetics. Gregor Mendel on your left is often referred to as the father of genetics, despite indigenous farmers on your right in southern Mexico implementing selective breeding in their farming as early as 10,000 years ago. Again, we see how the theories and ideas taught in STEM are often skewed to favor and glorify white history. In contrast, when we center the identities of BIPOC students, we are able to support and highlight people of color in STEM. Personally speaking, as Julia mentioned before, as we were creating this presentation, we both realized that every time we tried to come up with a non-Eurocentric scientific idea or a person that identified as BIPOC that was prominent in STEM, we weren't able to recall a single name. In that moment, I think I realized just how damaging that was in terms of sustaining our relationships with our culture, while also striving to pursue our interests in these fields. It built a very subconscious divide between who we are as students and who we are as people of color, a divide that I believe should not exist.
So what non-white stories should we talk about? Like we said in the main room, sharing the histories and legacies of struggle, power, resistance, and resilience in STEM of the identities of your students is a super powerful first step to involve, engage, and empower your students. Think critically about the identities of your students and show them how people who look like them and unlike them have struggled and made huge strides in STEM. For example, when you're talking about chemistry and combustion and balancing equations, you can talk about the invention of gunpowder by the Chinese. The combustion reaction is very interesting and complex and really challenging to balance. In your math class, you can talk about how the numbers we use, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, came from Hindu Arabic tradition and people. When talking about old medical practices or anatomy, you can talk about how ancient Egyptians had a really deep understanding of the human body in order to mummify people. They knew where a lot of major organs were and knew a lot more than white people of the same era. And when you're talking about ecology or human impact or green chemistry, you can talk about indigenous science and how indigenous people have observed and experimented and valued the land they call home for millennia. Yes, Irving, actually that's where my book is from. It's a Canada curricular book written by Indigenous people. So I'll share that resource later. It's an amazing, amazing book. Has a lot of hands-on Indigenous content. You can also share the stories of unsung scientists and their experiences with struggle, power, resistance, and resilience. Gladys West, this nice Black lady here, was from Virginia, who created and refined the most detailed and accurate mathematical model of the Earth, which is the basis for the modern day GPS. Percy Julian, this guy here, was a Black chemist who pioneered research in the chemical synthesis of naturally occurring chemicals, which is a basis for a lot of prescription drugs today. He was rejected from the Board of Trustees at DePauw University to become a professor, but in 1967, he became a member of the Board of Trustees. The Science and Mathematics Center at DePauw University is now dedicated to him. Lu Jimzhong was a Chinese immigrant who in the 1890s created a new breed of orange that ripened in the early fall and was more resistant to cold temperatures in Florida winters. His work with crossbreeding these oranges is the basis for Valencia oranges that we eat.
So here we're going to take a moment and just a moment to breathe, to kind of internalize all of the information that you've been given so far and consider the question, what are you teaching now that you think needs an anti-racist perspective? For example, at school, I'm taking a class on statistical methods, and I think it would be really interesting and empowering for me if my teacher talked about real-world applications of these methods for anti-racist movements that I am personally invested and passionate about. Feel free to share your responses in the chat if you're comfortable.
Another example is I teach biology to elementary schoolers, and I think showing them that a lot of people of color have made really big impacts in biology would be something really powerful to share. Yes, we're going to get into that. So I'm from California, like I said, and really topical for me right now is wildfires. So I'm sure a lot of the environmental science and biology teachers in the room talk about controlled wildfires and forest life cycles. A way to diversify the narrative is to also talk about indigenous science. Indigenous science, just like Western science, is a rich and rigorous and robust knowledge system developed from experiencing and attempting to make sense of nature. Indigenous science relies on data, observation, curiosity, and predictability, just like Western science. The difference is indigenous scientists are intimately connected to what they are studying, and they know that understanding nature is vital to the survival of their community. It was years of observation and data collection and curiosity and learning and symbiosis with their environment that led to the indigenous practice of controlled forest fires. That this data-driven practice became tradition and culture. Scientists and our education need to value the research that came from the indigenous people of this land. We need to include their perspective to completely understand forest life cycles and controlled wildfires. Another quote from the book that I'm talking about and I highly recommend is that the process of generating or learning indigenous ways of living in nature is coming to know. A phrase that connotates a journey which includes the goal of living in harmony with nature for the survival of the community. So in other words, indigenous scientists believe that the pursuit of knowledge is a journey. It's ongoing, and its goal is to live in harmony with nature for the survival of the community. Western scientists believe that the pursuit of knowledge is a destination. It's to discover. It's a paper or a patent or economic success. It's not understood and empowered as vital for our community. That's why we are facing climate crisis and rampant anti-vaccine and anti-mask sentiment. Western science didn't teach us to value science as vital for our community's survival. Indigenous science does. Indigenous science is more than just a body of knowledge. It's a way of life, a way of thinking, a mindset. Living scientifically with both the values of indigenous and Western science should be our way of life too. Another example of how to discuss race and STEM is by talking about the biology and anatomy of skin color. Melanin is a pigment produced by melanocytes in the integumentary system, and it protects the deeper layers of skin from harmful UV rays from the sun. This is an example of natural selection. Because the original humans lived in areas with a lot of sunlight, humans who had more UV ray protection were more fit to survive their living conditions. When humans started migrating to climates with less sunlight, we needed less melanin. A way to incorporate talking about race is acknowledging how Darwin's theory of evolution was used to uphold white supremacy through social Darwinism. Social Darwinism argued that people of color and poor people were biologically inferior and less fit, which made them suited for slavery and servitude and made injustices valid. It's a poignant historical example of how science and facts can be applied the wrong way. But the bottom line is, skin color is a gene for a pigment to protect us. And although biology has shown that there are no genetically distinct races, racial identity, how you and others perceive your race, is very real, as are its ramifications. And those are just a few ideas of how we can talk about race and STEM in the classroom. A few other ones briefly are for a psychology class. You can acknowledge that a lot of psychological studies are not representative of the general American population. For statistics, you can use data sets relating to racism and anti-racism to show concepts and talk about experimental design. For example, case studies for research about mass incarceration and the school to prison pipeline and police brutality. In a chemistry class, you can discuss the material science of Black, Indigenous, people of color traditional materials, such as silk, clay, porcelain, batik, and kapa. All of these materials have really deep and significant cultural value for a lot of the students in your classroom, but talking about them academically, talking about polymerization and intermolecular forces, and in a context of material science could be really, really powerful. Our final example is talking about human impact. So you could talk about how pollution and climate change impacts BIPOC communities and nations more than white ones. So what's holding you back? What's preventing you from talking about race in your STEM classroom? Are you scared that you won't have time to cover all of the academic standards, that it will be less rigorous science, that you'll have backlash? Instead of asking what you could lose by teaching race in your classroom, I challenge you to ask yourself, what will your classroom and your students gain? Your students will gain a fuller, deeper, more nuanced, more real-world application understanding of what you are teaching. And your students will see people who look like them, role models that inspire them to feel empowered and connected and feel like they belong in STEM, that their voices and identities and minds and hearts belong in STEM. We empower you to empower them. Embrace the stories of struggle, power, resistance, and resilience. Challenge your students and yourself to think about Indigenous science in parallel with Western science. Make powerful real-world connections. And imagine this. What could the world look like if all students felt like their STEM class was a home for them? So thank you. Thank you so much for your time and attention today. I feel like a lot of people think that anti-racism has no place in STEM. Please convince your colleagues that it does. We need anti-racist STEM teachers. Thank you for being here. Thank you for challenging yourself and taking time to be here and be present and learn. I'm going to share right now in the chat some of my favorite resources. The book that I was quoting a lot is actually written by Indigenous scientists in Canada, and it has a really great section of practical curriculum that you can use in your classroom. And also I'm adding the Scientific American report for Black Lives Matter. It's a lot of resources about scientific resources, because it's by the Scientific American, about the Black Lives Matter movement. And it could be a good starting point for a lot of you who want to implement talking about race and STEM in your classroom.
So the humanities room, we're planning on joining back with the humanities room in a minute. They need about 3 more minutes. So if there's like a discussion question that we could go to just while we wait for them to finish up before we head back.
For sure. So just so you have something to take away to your classrooms and from this webinar, we implore you to consider the question, what was something you learned that surprised you? For me, as I was doing research on this, Anna really helped me understand the roots of the Pythagorean theorem, and it was really interesting for me to learn how language itself really contributes to kind of upholding white supremacy. So drop your answers in the chat if you want, or just simply reflect on them and think about how you can take that into your classroom with you.
Yeah, the Pythagorean theorem was a really interesting one that I learned from Mike Brown from the Freedom Fellows Institute. And the way that he put it into his classroom, which really struck me, was like having students discover that on their own, like probing them to think about like who, like asking them who did it first. And then I remember one of the worksheets that I saw that he created was one of the questions said like, what should the Pythagorean theorem be called? Like if, you know, like what, how could we, you know, make this right? Or how would we change it? Like if we could be in control of how it was called, and truly giving credit where credit is due, which I thought was really interesting. The one that really struck me was about like anatomy and biology with mummifications. Like I knew that, but I had only ever like come across in like a history context, never in connection to STEM, and thinking about again, like credit where credit is due, and using that knowledge to help us get a better understanding of our whatever subject that we're trying to learn.
Yeah, and I love the Indigenous science section. I didn't really know that much about it, but after reading this book and doing a lot of research, I realized how powerful and valid it is. And I would encourage you guys, it seems like a lot of you here are already implementing a lot of these things in your classroom. I encourage you to invite your colleagues to watch the recording of our webinar if they're not, because as you can see, our main room had like 100 participants, 80 of them were humanities, 20 of them were STEM. We'd love to have that balance be 50-50. So talk to your colleagues about this, talk to them about like racism in STEM, because before I joined working on this team, working with this amazing Dawn Council, I hadn't really thought about it either.
Yeah, and I feel super connected to Julia because I feel like Julia and I are the opposite. Like she is a pre-med major who is stepping into this world of like social justice and anti-racism, and I'm an ethnic studies major who is stepping into the world of computer science and like deciding that I want to pursue a double major in symbolic systems, which is the major that Carlene's also pursuing. And I feel super like I was telling her earlier, I feel super connected to you because I think the vulnerability that you're showing coming in here is like the vulnerability that I have going into STEM, and like really trying to bridge those worlds because we know that like I constantly think like would I have been this hesitant to pursue would I have been this hesitant to pursue a major in symbolic systems if I had had teachers that made me feel like symbolic systems or computer science was a place that I could belong? And like not only that I could belong, but that like my passion and dedication to anti-racism was intersected with STEM and could coexist. And I didn't feel like I have to be like giving up this anti-racist passion in order to pursue a career or an education in STEM. I think is super important. Okay, let me check in on the humanities room.
Thank you guys so much for being here. Yes, exactly. It's a pervasive issue that impacts all of us. And especially like talking about how like white STEM is. Like Carlene and I, we really couldn't think of anybody who was a scientist that we learned about in school. We had to do like Googling, and it took one Google search, like Black famous scientists, and we found all of these amazing people that we had just never heard of. So yes, big change. It's gonna originate with us.
I think there's like there's this really interesting Twitter thread that's called Black in the Ivory Tower, and I encourage all of you to check it out just for some personal experiences of BIPOC people in these spaces and why it's so necessary that we bring more STEM into the anti-racist movement.
Yes.
Yes, diversity in academia.
Yeah, that's a great point. That was kind of what's holding you back. I think that talking about STEM with more real world applications, including racism, is a more rigorous understanding of the concept. I think the more real world applications we have for STEM, the more it makes sense to our students going into their lives, just past like the AP test or your final exam. So I think that it's like more rigorous science, and that parents should see that those connections will actually help their kids in the future.
I agree. I think a lot of the pushback that I get in my advocacy is like the classroom is not a space to be political. And I feel like especially like one, we know that everything is political, but like besides that, like when we talk about just like diversifying the narrative, like there's really nothing political about that. It's about justice, it's about the well-being of young people of color, and it's about truth. It's about looking at science or whatever we're looking at from not a different lens, but a fuller lens, one that really allows us to understand whatever we're studying in its total entirety. So with that, I think we're gonna head on back into the main room. So I'm gonna stop